Hello all, welcome to my channel. Today's topic for discussion is fancy and imagination. See what it is. Fancy and imagination. The distinction between fancy and imagination was a key element in Samuel Taylor Coleridge's theory of poetry as well as in his general theory of the mental processes. I repeat, the distinction between fancy and imagination was a key element in Samuel Taylor Coleridge's theory of poetry as well as in his general theory of the mental processes. In earlier discussions, fancy and imagination had for the most important part been used synonymously to denote a faculty of the mind which is distinguished from reason, judgment, and memory in that it receives images from the senses and records them into new combinations. In the 13th chapter of Biographia Literaria, which was published in 1817, Coleridge attributes this reordering function of the sensory images to the law faculty he calls fancy. Fancy has no other counters to play with but fixities and definites. The fancy is indeed no other than a mode of memory emancipated from the order, time, and space. To Coleridge, that is, the fancy is a mechanical process which receives the elementary images, the fixities and definities which come to it ready made from the senses and without altering the parts, resembles them into a different spatial and temporal order from that in which they were originally perceived. The imagination, however, which produces a much higher kind of poetry. Coleridge's imagination that is able to create rather than merely resemble by dissolving the fixities and definities, the mental pictures or images received from the senses and unifying them into a new whole. And while the fancy is merely mechanical, the imagination is vital. That is, it is an organic faculty which operates not like a sorting machine but like a living and growing plant. As Coleridge says elsewhere, the imagination generates and produces a form of its own, while its rules are the very powers of growth and production. And in the 14th chapter of the Biographia, Coleridge adds his famous statement that the synthetic power, which is the imagination, reveals itself in the balance or reconciliation of opposite or discordant qualities, of sameness with difference, of the general with the concrete, the idea with the image. The faculty of imagination, in other words, assimilates and synthesizes the most disparate elements into an organic whole, that is, a newly generated unity constituted by an interdependence of parts whose identity cannot survive their removal from the whole. Most critics after Coleridge who distinguished fancy from imagination tended to make fancy simply the faculty that produces a lesser, lighter, or humorous kind of poetry, and to make imagination the faculty that produces a higher, more serious, and more passionate poetry. And the concept of imagination itself is as various as the modes of psychology that critics have adopted, while its process vary according to the way in which a critic conceives of the nature of a poem as essentially realistic or essentially visionary, as a verbal construction or as a myth, as pure poetry or as a work designed to produce effects on an audience. So that's all about fancy and imagination. Hope you understood. Thank you.